Okay, so welcome everyone to this February session, Poetry and Story at the Intersection of Climate and Race. Again, I'm Rod Downing from Vancouver, Canada. I am the host. I wanted to just spend, though, a minute to set the stage for this session. This series has been going on for about a year now. And we like to start off with our overall vision, which is the flourishing of life for all. Now, I wanted to take just a minute looking at that. It is, to me, a wonderful phrase because this includes all life, not simply human life, for starters. And as we've gone through the series, we have had, first of all, a session devoted entirely to the biodiversity, in other words, focused on non-human life. And that has come up again from time to time, kind of woven through the series. Today, however, and again, we're wanting to look at the final two words of that, the flourishing of life for all. Because one of the downsides of any type of overarching theme is that the dominant group of people can easily see that simply within their lens, and thus it easily reinforces any marginalization that could be occurring. And so in this session, we're going back again to those final two words, the well-being of all. And as I say, while we have looked at the non-human aspects of that, today we want to look at the human aspects, and in particular, those communities that can be and have definitely been marginalized by what is still a valuable visionary statement, but one that can easily sweep such considerations away. And we definitely recognize it needs to be all. So this is, I've been really anticipating this session. And at this point, then, I will simply turn the session over to Dean to carry on. Dean, you, of course, you'll have to unmute.
Right. And I'm trying to get my slide to advance and can't seem to get it to do so. There we are. So wanted to remind you, first of all, that following this session today, in 2 weeks, we're going to, as has been our practice, have a follow-up session where we engage in some conversation about what we learn and hear today. And that will be on Sunday, February 27th, again at 2 o'clock Pacific time, and you can see the other time zones indicated there. In March, we're going to hope to continue on our topic of eco-racism and the impacts of climate on diverse communities. We're looking at a late March session, break our pattern a little bit. And so that session will be on the 20th, and we'll have a follow-up conversation, which we'll announce the date for at that time, if not before. So let me just also set the stage a little bit, because today's webinar is the first of what we hope will be a series of webinars on the disparate impact that the climate emergency is having on people of color, on marginalized communities within North America, and on exploited and impoverished regions throughout the world. We hope to present speakers on climate migration, immigration, and on the impact on Indigenous communities and what we may learn from their experience and their response. As we consider the impact of climate, we have the responsibility to understand the racial context in which that impact is unfolding. Each of us lives in a particular place with a particular history of injustice and racism. Now, I live in Bellingham, Washington, and students and faculty in our local university have created Bellingham's racial history timeline. So this is our history as it relates to race and injustice relative to the Indigenous community and other communities in Bellingham and Whatcom County. And of course, we start with who were the original inhabitants of this region, the Coast Salish people, who have inhabited this region for at least 13,000 years. But beginning in 1770, there was the first incursion by Europeans into the region as they attempted to carry out their explorations, and in the process began to spread diseases among the tribal populations and the first peoples in the area. By 1830, we then began to see the first incursion by Europeans by land as the early Euro-American settlers arrived on the Oregon Trail, and tribes were dispossessed and Blacks were excluded from whatever settlements began to take place. In 1852, we had the first Bellingham Bay Settlers, and the Lummi chief, Chowitz Hoot, allowed Henry Roeder and Russell Peabody to build their first lumber mill in the Bellingham area. 3 years later, by 1855, reservations had been established, and Lummi and other tribes were forced onto those reservations within 3 years after the first Euro-American settlement. In 1858, the territory denied citizenship to Blacks, and it supported the right of slave owners to arrive with slaves in the colony. In the 1860s, Chinese workers arrived, brought in for jobs in the coal mine, clearing land, or working in service capacities for the settlers in the Bellingham area. By 1880, residential schools had been established into which Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and put into those schools. And their culture was assaulted basically by the process of education in those schools. In 1882, we saw the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act, a federal law which denied entry of Chinese into the United States, and that was not repealed until 1943. In 1884, the lynching of Louis Sam, an Indigenous teenage boy that a mob lynched within the boundaries of the city of Bellingham. In 1885, then Chinese were expelled from Bellingham based on a campaign by a local newspaper. Discrimination in the 1890s involving canneries employing immigrant labor, but workers were confined to company properties. In 1906, the first Black student was allowed entry into the state normal school. It became Western Washington University. In 1906, South Asians began to arrive, many of them of the Sikh faith, coming to work in the lumber mills in Bellingham. But a year later, those South Asians were expelled on September 4th, 1907, driven out and forced to leave Bellingham. In the 20s, there was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the Pacific Northwest, and that resulted in a parade in 1926, where over 700 participants marched down the streets of Bellingham. And by 1929, there was a convention of the KKK in which the mayor of Bellingham presented a key to the city. 1930s, the real estate exclusion codes began to be enacted as properties were sold. We're all familiar with the 1942 Japanese internment during World War II. And in the 50s, the practice of sundowning, that is, police officers routinely driving Black Americans to the outskirts of the city and telling them to leave. The 60s saw Western Washington University students join in the kinds of protests that we all experienced who were alive at that time. The 60s and 70s fish wars over fishing rights. violence against Lummi fishers, a 1994 cross burning on the driveway of a migrant family outside Bellingham. And more recently, a number of events happening in much more rapid succession: 1995 skinhead violence, 2000 racist incidents, 2003 flags, nooses, and slurs at Ferndale High School, 2011 the anti-Muslim radio station was established and became an organization marked by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. 2015, hate speech closes Western's campus for a day. Racialized food desert in 2016 in Bellingham as stores were closed and there were covenants on the property where the store was that other competing groceries could not be brought into that site. In 2016, anti-Semitism, 2017, Islamophobia. In 2018, a group called the Atomwaffen, a white supremacist group, became active in Blaine and Bellingham. Again, in that same year, immigrant detentions, there was racist graffiti at Western. 2019, racist propaganda distributed throughout Bellingham and flyers. The ongoing challenge and issue of missing Native women, which became particularly important when the records of those missing women were highlighted in 2019. And on, even today, racist slurs and racism in relation to health, many things that occur to emphasize that racism is alive within our communities. So this is the context in which climate impact must be understood in my community. And at the conclusion of today's sessions, I'll be inviting each of you to research that kind of history of racism in your own place and begin to consider the disparate impacts of the climate crisis in your community. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for today, Ashia Ajani. Racial justice is deeply entangled in climate mitigation issues, from disparate impacts on communities of color, to distribution of green zones, to availability of subsidies, to the transition from fossil fuels to electricity in our homes and businesses. And so we're delighted to welcome to our February climate webinar, Ashia Ajani, to share with us on the topic of poetry and story at the intersection of climate and race. Ashia Ajani uses they, she pronouns. Ashia is an environmental justice educator, a poet, and a storyteller, and she hails from Denver, Colorado, Queen City of the Plains, and the unceded territory of the Cheyenne, Ute, Arapahoe, and Comanche peoples. Ashia is working on an environmental studies doctorate at the University of Oregon and seeks to address underlying anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity in contemporary environmental policy and ecology research. Ashia works toward bold, ecologically just Black futures. They have contributed words in several publications and are, above all else, a dreamer. And Ashia will also share Land Acknowledgement with us. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and allow you, Ashia, to share yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that transition and intro, Dean. Hello, everyone. It is so powerful and so amazing to be here. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your space. I'm going to share my screen in a little bit, but as I start with the land acknowledgement, I usually like to keep everybody kind of focused on each other when we do the land acknowledgement. So we'll start off actually by putting a link in the chat. Whoops, I have the wrong link. And this link is to a map where you can put in where you live, or really anywhere if you're curious, and see whose territory you are inhabiting. Now, usually it's a lot more accurate for the United States and different places in the Americas. Once you start venturing out, it gets a little less accurate, but it's a pretty good and up-to-date website where you can, if you're from Colorado, if you're from Seattle, if you're from Vancouver, you can look and see whose territory you are on. So I'm currently in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm actually on the Catawba people's land. Catawba is a larger group of smaller indigenous communities. This happens often where a lot of indigenous communities that have different ethnic groups get collapsed into one nation, which is another form of violence and another form of erasure. So once you see, you know, like what land you're on, I highly suggest just like looking up because sometimes it's a collapsed category, sometimes the name isn't entirely accurate. And just highly recommend that people, you know, get used to diving in more, you know, after we like get an answer for something, like just making sure that answer is accurate. Because unfortunately, we live in an era of a lot of false information or not complete information being distributed. That being said, hopefully people get a chance to look at that map. I want to start off with a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. And the quote goes, "One of our responsibilities as human people is to find ways to enter into reciprocity with the more than human world. We can do it through gratitude, through ceremony, through land stewardship, science, art, and in everyday acts of practical reverence." If I was reading this when I was in Oregon, I would start with, we are on Kalapuyan land, but I will start with, I am on Catawba land. Indigenous peoples are not a monolithic community. There are 574 federally recognized and ethnically, culturally, and linguistically diverse nations in the United States. We acknowledge that the University of Oregon is a historically and contemporarily majority white institution located on the Kalapuya Ilihi, the homeland of the Kalapuya people. Treaties of the 1850s dispossessed Kalapuya people of their indigenous homeland by the United States government. They were forcibly removed. Descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indian of Oregon. We express our respect for all federally recognized tribal nations of Oregon and for all displaced indigenous peoples who call this land home. Each day, these individuals and communities are contributing to this land at the UO, in their nations, and across the region we refer to as Oregon. We also acknowledge and remember that Oregon is a state founded on anti-Blackness with legalized Black exclusion laws. We are reconciling with this history. Awesome, and thank you for people who are looking, who are posting what they found in the chat about the land that they inhabit. With that, I will conclude the land acknowledgement and we can jump into some introductions. So I recognize that there are a lot of people on this call and I wish that we could go around and I could hear everybody's voices. But unfortunately, I want to make sure that we do some writing. I want to make sure that we do some reading. So if possible in the chat, if you could write your name, pronoun, place you call home, and one thing that inspires you about the world, I will just like kind of randomly read some out loud. That way we can tune into each other and get to know each other better. For me, I'm Ashia. I use they, she pronouns. The place that I call home is Denver, Colorado. 303 runs through my blood. Great chili is in my veins. And one thing that inspires me about the world is I work a lot with youth. And the youth very much inspire me about this world. And so I'm seeing people are starting to put some indigenous territory that they occupy, and hopefully we'll get a couple of introductions too. I especially love to hear one thing that inspires people about the world. Okay, awesome. Folks are tuning in. Oh, Chesterfield, UK, very cool. Sue Ann is inspired by a sense of community. Kathy is inspired by all the many people committed to making the world better for all. Cool. The world is such a beautiful tapestry of all creation. Yes, all connected. Inspired by groups like this that raise awareness. Awesome. Right. Goodness, fairness, whenever he sees it, from Rod. Wow, all over the place. This is what's so cool about like the Zoom universe too. It connects people from all over. Inspired by the Earth's immense beauty. Thank you for sharing, Sheila. Interconnectedness. Inspired by the beauty of nature all around the world. Absolutely. Resiliency of people and nature. Incredible diversity. Oh yes, they're like flowing in now. This is beautiful. Absolutely. So I highly encourage, if people haven't shared yet, to continue. I'm gonna press on just so that we have enough time, to really talk. But it's so lovely to meet everyone, to hear, what really inspires you, and hopefully we can bring some of that into our workshop today. I want to start off by saying, and I noticed that some people had some heart backgrounds, say Happy Valentine's Day. One thing that I really appreciate, especially about like writing from like Robin Wall Kimmerer, but also people like Bell Hooks, Rebecca Solnit, is really the emphasis on love. And I think oftentimes, especially, we think about love as something that's purely romantic, but there's love of community, love of family. And Bell Hook, like Bell Hooks said, indeed, all great movements for social justice strongly emphasize a love ethic. And then I want to look at the one below it. The widespread assumption that ethical behavior takes the fun out of life is false. In actuality, living ethically ensures that relationships in our lives, including encounters with strangers, nurture our spiritual growth. Looking at that last quote, are there any initial responses or comments about this widespread assumption that ethical behavior takes the fun out of life?
Well, I'll jump in because I always have something to say. This is Mary Dale. I was typing. So to me, I feel like, yes, in fact, what I see is amongst my peers is sort of just an apathy around ethical behavior. And sometimes it seems like not only is it sort of unsexy, but it's like made to seem corny. And so that's where I think folks say, oh, it takes the fun out of life or whatever, because it's sort of cornball. And the same thing comes to when we talk about using politically correct terms, or, how we've come a long way in the workplace as far as, what you can and cannot say and that type of thing, especially between genders. And I know that sometimes people get really touchy about, why do we have to be so politically correct? It's not very fun or whatever. It takes we can't joke with people. But a lot of times for me, when somebody's joking, it doesn't always feel like a joke. So I take it very seriously, and I'm glad that we've come as far as we've come around being more respectful and ethical, especially in the workplace.
Thank you for sharing, Mary. I think that you were hinting at something, especially towards the end, around this sort of divide between fun and ethical. And I think oftentimes when people say like, oh, it isn't fun, or it isn't like, it's overly formal, or it's like not casual enough, oftentimes they're forgetting, or they're very like willingly neglecting the fact that, like Dean shared, like there's a long history behind these kind of like engagement. There's a long history of oppression. There's history behind words. And especially as we think, about the climate crisis, there's like a lot of push for people to become like more sustainable, for people to like, really just like care about the earth. And sometimes that gets pushed to the wayside. We don't see caring for the earth as an ethical responsibility or as a moral calling. And so I think one of the things that Bell Hooks is trying to hint at is, how do we make life, and how do we make our relationship, human land, human animal, animal land relationships, a responsibility? Any other comments on the Bell Hook quotes before we move on? I want to take like we looked at Bell Hooks, who's, if folks are not familiar with her, she recently passed actually. She was a very famous Black feminist theorist and writer, Anti-Woman, All About Love, Teaching to Transgress. Highly recommend. And I'm gonna take it back many, many years and introduce Elizabeth Barrett Browning. She oftentimes is called the female William Wordsworth, if folks are familiar with that poet. He wrote a lot about the sort of like romanticized vision of nature. So finding like, really like thinking about the sublime, nature as a perfect, pristine place. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she did some similar writing in that regard. But hers was kind of like more thinking about like in the vein of bell hooks, in the vein of Kimmerer. Earth is a moral calling. Earth is an ethical calling. And one of my favorite quotes of hers is from her book, Aurora Lay. Earth's crammed with heaven, but only he who sees takes off his shoes. Anybody want to dissect what Barrett Browning is trying to say with this quote? Any thoughts?
Well, too often we go through life just unaware, not paying attention. And I think Barrett Browning is basically calling us to live in the moment, to be mindful of what's happening around us, to take notice. And in that moment, to respect and honor the world around us, the people around us, the nature around us.
Yes. Thank you so much, Susan. So beautifully said. I see that Diane also put in the chat, sacredness is everywhere, pay attention. Dean contributed with we see with all of our senses. And I think all three of you, like very much are tapping into that thread of paying attention. So much around climate change, especially, is about not paying attention. If it's not fully within our line of sight, or if it's not happening around us, we tend to think that it's not happening, or it's some other place that's happening away, but we all inhabit Earth. I see that your hand up is Mary.
Yes, when you do take off your shoes, wow, you open up your senses to so much more. What a beautiful thing it is.
Yes. Yes, excellent observation, Mary. Like what happens when we do make that leap, when we do take off our shoes, when we do allow ourselves to feel. Lori, I see you had a hand up.
Well, I was just going to add, loving the way that this ties in with the story of Moses taking his shoes off at the burning bush. Rabbi Kushner says, and how long did he stand in silence looking in order to notice that the bush was burning? So it says paying attention, but not with the kind of snappy way we think we're paying attention, but it's a really deep, silent place that stands and looks and takes it in and really has the time to expand and then recognize that holiness, to take the shoes off and walk on sacred earth.
Yes. Thank you, Lori. Nancy.
Yeah, I grew up in southeastern Alaska and spent a lot of time as a child in the forest. And in that part of Alaska, is a rainforest. So, and there's this amazing connection with your feet to the ground, and the feel of the softness under your feet, or and at the same time looking up, the same thing. And then I thought about my experiences on the beach barefoot as well, and how there are these wonderful different textures that kind of infuse you as you experience nature. You get the same kind of thing with eyes and ears as well, but there's something very special about making connection.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nancy. I see Peter has his hand up. Peter might be the last comment that we take for this section, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to move on. But I want to acknowledge the folks who are contributing in the chat. Thank you. So go ahead, Peter.
I think that just as a plant has neither eyes nor ears, it's possibly unconscious of our existence. Similarly, a dog is consciously aware of us, but may not be aware of the earth rotating around the sun and science and stuff. And this is like a law that higher things are unconscious to us. And I think we're immersed in the spiritual world in a continuum. But if you understand that, like it's all around us, like fish in water, we're immersed in the spiritual realm. But if you are unaware of that, you don't notice it. But if you are aware of that, you notice a lot of things that you wouldn't otherwise notice.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, Peter. I think, you know, the awareness aspect that is a very similar thread that's coming out in a lot of folks' comments. And then once, I guess, like even when you tune into that awareness, I think it also opens the door for a certain level of grief, because then you see, you know, like how certain things are getting destroyed, how particular communities are being affected. But you need to have that foresight. You need to be able to open up your mind. You need to be able to see the heaven on earth in order to act. So I want to take a kind of like a shift and think about the concept of disaster. I think there's like been a lot of talk, especially with like climate change very prevalently in the news. We hear about natural disasters, we hear about famine, but I really want us to think about, what does disaster mean and for whom? So here's an excerpt from a poem by a Malian poet named Warsan Shire. She's one of my favorites, and the poem itself is much longer, and I can put the link in the chat once we start doing some writing. But I will go ahead and read this first part. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you breathe bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck, and even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you wouldn't be going back. So after taking some time to read this poem, which she wrote specifically about the Sudanese war, but I think one aspect of the Sudan war conflict and a lot of other conflicts that are happening globally are very much climate motivated and are very much environmental motivated. At a very surface level, it was very much about territory and it was about ethnic conflict. But I think one thing that people are lacking in their analysis, especially of disaster, is how climate and environmental issues just make things so much more worse in a region. And so I want folks to take maybe the next 5 minutes. Actually, no, we're gonna do a quick one because we have a little bit more writing coming up later. We're gonna take 2 minutes to just jot down some notes for ourselves following this prompt. What does disaster mean and for whom? So I'm gonna put on a 2-minute timer and we're just gonna write to ourselves. What came up for folks as you were writing about this? Oh, I see someone, ooh, super anticipating already put in the chat. Marvin, disaster means a problem causing loss, all the migrations associated, being driven out of native countries are disastrous. Yes, very excellent observation.
Well, this is Lori Long from Lamoni, and I was thinking disaster is something that is often a negative change that's so big that we are changed as well. It leaves a lasting impact. It's not to say that the impact can't help lead to positive responses, but it's a large disasters is more than just a small impact.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Lori. See, Nancy has her hand up.
I said disaster is more devastating to those without resources or connections. A total disruption of normal life, chaos, personal and community.
Yes. Maybe let's get one more person to share out what they wrote. Thank you, Nancy.
I wrote a whole list of words that were negative, but then I remembered the disasters that I've been around have really brought people together. There have been people who you would never see working together otherwise, who come together and join their efforts in helping to meet the needs that are there.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
there's always positive that comes out of negative.
Mhm. Thank you, Lila. Is it Lila?
Yes.
Lila. Okay, thank you so much, Lila. And I think that that's a very important piece to also think about. One example that immediately comes to mind is thinking about New Orleans. There was severe governmental neglect that happened during Hurricane Katrina. However, a lot of people on the ground, they banded together, they shared resources, they helped people who had disabilities or people who were older, made sure that they had the proper medical care that they needed. There is a really great journal entry written by Audrey Lord, where she was in St. Croix when there was a really devastating hurricane that passed through the island. And she spoke about how disaster kind of reminds us, it very much reminds us of our humanity and, you know, and the fragileness of existence. But it also reminds us like what we could be doing on a daily basis to support one another, so that if a disaster were to come through again, we would have the resilience, we would have the resources, like Nancy said, in order to make it through. Before we move on to our next prompt, does anybody have any final thoughts or questions?
So I'm also a person in recovery, and you know, that's just such a part of my life. And there's a portion in the big book that we use, the AA book, and it talks about, well, a lot of the imagery is compared to the time when it came out, which was in the 30s. So there's a lot of imagery around the Titanic, and the same thing goes with addiction. It talks about being survivors of a shared peril, you know, and that, again, we have to band together as survivors. And just like that we do in fellowship with others, or in, you know, in the church, that we band together when things are hard and things are bad, and we lean on each other in that shared struggle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing, Mary. So I begin, you know, with some quotes, and then I move a little bit more into an excerpt of a poem, because I really want to hint at the power of storytelling. Storytelling has been a part of human communication, human phenomena for millennia. Even before we had language, humans found a way to share stories. When you see cave drawings, a lot of those, there's actually a really cool person in anthropology who did a lot of research. A lot of those were movies. It's how they would use shadow, they would use tricks to tell stories, to create narratives, to preserve myths. And the purpose of storytelling is to connect us together. Stories reveal what is important, what our values are, what is worthy of preservation. And recent research has shown that poetry has been revealed to increase empathy and is a very effective teaching tool, particularly when it comes to topics like climate change. Because climate change is still such a contentious topic, oftentimes if you have a human narrative behind what is happening, people start to tune in more. So there are a lot of poets, especially from vulnerable islands like Vanuatu, Tuvalu, the Polynesian islands, whose homes currently are under massive threat and massive climate change already, who speak a lot about what is happening. And that is a way of them not only to preserve their cultural history, but to also express to others the pain, the grief, and what is needed in order to survive these crises. For me in particular, I'm Black, Creek, Puerto Rican. Storytelling has been a cornerstone of the Black tradition since before the transatlantic slave trade. It was and still is a way to harbor memory, pass on tradition from generation to generation, and honor the histories that make up Black life. I want to also follow this up with a quote by Sylvia Winter. She is still alive. She is a Jamaican theorist and writer, drawing off of Aimé Césaire, who was really powerful anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist writer. And she writes, "Human beings are magical, bios and logos. Words made flesh, muscle, and bone, animated by hope and desire. Belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our actualities. And the maps of spring always have to be redrawn again in undared forms." And the reason that I like this quote so much is for three parts, especially. Belief materialized in deeds, deeds which crystallize our actuality. It's kind of drawing back to what Barrett Browning was saying about people can't see that earth is chock full of heaven until they take off of their shoes. Also ties into some of the bell hooks quotes that we discussed earlier. The things that we do have very significant impact. The way that we function, our engagements, our daily engagements, but also our engagement with earth, with industry, with different corporations, that pattern is going to affect the earth. It's going to affect us and it's going to affect the earth. The second part that I really like is the maps of spring always have to be redrawn again. Spring is a time of newness, renewal. Are we going to continue doing the same thing year after year? What is the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So we're always redrawing these maps, and we have the power to redraw these maps. And that last part that I want to hint at is the in undared forms. What ways are we willing to live so that we can have a better relationship between humans and the earth? What things are we willing to give up? What things are we willing to sacrifice? What things are we willing to invest in? Gonna pause. Oh, I see that Mary has raised her hand. Perfect segue.
I just was gonna draw a parallel. So I feel like in much when that phrase, the maps of spring always have to be redrawn again in undared forms. I think of George Floyd and all of the things that happened in response to his death. You know, that was a time of, hey, we need to reimagine this stuff. This is really, really, really not working. And it's not working for a lot of people, you know, and it's caused people to look at the justice system in different ways, policing in different ways, you know, possibly defunding police and all different kinds of viewpoints around that. And then I also think about the pandemic and the forest fires, you know, other forms of what in my mind is disastrous, but also calling us to really reassess and you know, redraw the part about, wow, you know, we're having these forest fires every year and they're getting worse. How do we reimagine what we need to do to affect the change? So it's calling us to a greater participation with each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary. I love that last phrase that you use, a greater participation with each other. And I think that's a lot of what Winter is trying to get at in this quote. So I want to think about, you know, in a shift about especially like redrawing the maps of spring. Also, you know, following up with what Mary said about, you know, like a greater participation with each other. I think about envisioning freedom as a place. I don't like to start off with a lot of hard facts. I've noticed, and one of the reasons that I use poetry and the reason that I use storytelling in a lot of my work is because facts are great. And I think that, you know, I think that the hard data is very, very important. But recognizing like I said, recognizing the human impact and that really sort of like how individuals and how certain groups are affected, I think is communicated a lot more effectively through storytelling. Some things that we know that frontline communities who are most going to be impacted by climate change are communities of color. They're Black communities, they're Indigenous communities, Latin, Asian communities, Middle Eastern communities, and that's globally, not just in the United States. But already many people of color live in environmentally unsound communities. Environmental injustice is a huge problem that's going to lead to climate injustice. A lot of places do not have the infrastructure to deal with climate change. We saw it in New Orleans, we're seeing it in California, we saw it in Texas when that huge winter storm passed through and the entire grid shut down. And one might think, okay, well, all of Texas was affected. Communities of color, communities that have been historically neglected, they're always going to get hit harder because they do not have the initial resources that are already in place that would have lessened the blow. In fact, things end up being worse because they do not have that sort of infrastructure or the resources that Nancy brought up in place. And like Mary said, also in the chat, Flint, Michigan, with the water crisis as well. So one freedom dreaming activity that I like to do is envisioning freedom as a place. And that's reframing our understanding and engagements with nature. I borrow some wisdom from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. She writes a lot against the prison industrial complex. She writes a lot about different geographies, but she thinks of land as an animate, ever-changing object that we are responsible to and in turn will provide for us. So when we're thinking especially about environmentally neglected communities or environmentally burdensome communities, oftentimes people say, oh, well, it's because they don't take care of their community or they don't take care of their neighborhood and that's why they are facing this. The fact is that there has never been a chance for people, that I don't want to say that there's never been a chance, but there's been significant barriers in place for people to actively engage with their community and to actively engage with nature. If you look at a lot of communities that are most going to be impacted by climate change, oftentimes they are incredibly concrete laden. There's not a lot of green space. Trash pickup is very infrequent. There's a constant, some might even call it conspiracy against a lot of these communities who will most be affected by air pollution, by forest fires, by flooding. And it's sort of kind of like an engaging cycle. And I like what Judy put in the chat too. Author writes that we need to love the earth as a neighbor. What would that look like, if we love the earth as a neighbor? What would it look like if we saw our neighbors as part of the earth too? So I want to think, very critically, not everyone has the same encounters with nature. And cutting humans off from nature is a colonial enterprise that prioritizes productivity and extraction of labor over reciprocity, especially in the Western world, especially in America. We do not have a good relationship with the environment. Oftentimes it is one of extraction or it's one of subjugation. We either want to build, we want to raise down trees, we want to extract resources, but we don't want to think about what that reciprocity would look like. Envisioning freedom as a place means recognizing the historical ways that Indigenous people, Black people, other people of color have not been able to engage meaningfully with the earth. And what would it look like to envision freedom as a place so that we can have these opportunities for us and to also, and for people and for other settlers, for them to engage better with the earth. See, there's a really cool, ooh, Kathy's already on it, thinking about things to change and to shift. Eat lower on the food chain, have smaller house budget. Working on policies that disassemble racism, learning new skills. So really thinking about, what needs to give, what ways can we live our lives for the earth and for each other. Also seeing some other people putting in observations, Mary. Poor neighborhoods oftentimes used as dumping grounds, again, on the front lines of environmental burden and community change. I see Dean also put in one of his observations, lived in a multiracial community in Des Moines, Iowa, shadow of the Gold Dome Capitol. Many homes had outdoor toilets, drew their water. I'm like losing all of because sometimes, okay. Written off had not been protected as well as by levies as others, wealthier neighborhoods had. So this is very common. So much infrastructure and so much resource distribution is incredibly racist and is incredibly classist too. And so if you are not already set up in a good position to be able to weather a climate disaster, then we see what Warsan Shire is saying in that poem, no one leaves home unless they are forced to. So how do we mitigate the impacts? And how do we make it so work towards a future where people are not forced to? Okay, currently 2:58. Let's take some comments on this section since we have a little bit of time. Any observations or things folks want to share?
There's a lot of modern day colonialism taking place. It's reflected in, like, if you go to, if an Indigenous person, I'm in Australia, by the way, if an Indigenous person went into a hospital, they're just as likely to be not treated as well as a white person. There's lots of places where colonial thinking is still very strong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, as you were saying before, it's also in the extraction of resources and just about everything. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Also awesome quote to share in that regard too. Plant, I see Lila put plant and animal world could survive just fine without humans, but humans cannot survive without plants and animals. Overall, yes. And one thing that I think is actually a really great connection to the quote that Peter put was, I think sometimes the mentality that animals or plants don't need us can come from some colonial thinking. When settlers first landed in the New World, they saw it as like this veritable paradise. There were fruit trees everywhere. There was an abundance of bushes and food. And they just thought it came like that, not realizing that it took indigenous people years of engaging with the earth, thinking about like what grows well here, what plants do we cycle out to make sure that the soil remains fertile. So there's a lot of effort that goes into environmental planning, and a lot of effort that goes into making sure that different ecosystems thrive. For one example, in California, the wildfires, that's a result of actually human neglect. If humans were able to do controlled burns, if indigenous people were able to do controlled burns that they normally would do prior to colonization, we would not be seeing as many forest fires as we're seeing now. Also in the US. Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, just an observation and a comment. When in all kinds of urbanization, the problem becomes that especially in the area, we live in Seattle, we get a fair amount of rain and we get it heavy, but the minute you start putting blacktop and houses and all of these kinds of things everywhere, then the natural water systems just get really messed up. And then for a long time, nobody thought about it. And now we're having to come back and collect it from roofs. Our church roof has like 4 cisterns off of it, because the city decided it's a whole lot cheaper to put in rainwater collection systems than it is to tear the streets up in order to separate the sewer and the runoff water. And we were having trouble, they were having trouble with it sewage backing up into the lake. So it's like just thinking about putting permeable surfaces instead of blacktopping everything. Yeah. And I spent a fair amount of time teaching in Europe, and there I think they have a longer history. And so even parking lots are often with these cement formations that are permeable. They have holes in them, so there's grass or moss in between, and so the entire parking area or the entire area, instead of being completely non-permeable, is able to absorb, and the trees around there are able to be more helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you for drawing in that real world example, Nancy, and really great observation. I think especially one thing that you're bringing up is, especially in America, because we have such a short-lived history, the United States as a nation, we lose a lot of cultural memory. And that has been a very purposeful, engagement and a very purposeful project. But I think especially in the United States, we care more about a short-term solution and then addressing that if anything comes up, rather than thinking, more of an indigenous frame of thinking, like thinking 7 generations in the future, or thinking, more long-term. And so I think one thing about envisioning freedom as a place, that shift needs to happen, where we're stopping to think short-term and we're starting to think a lot more long-term, like what is going to be sustainably viable after 20, 30, 50 years. I'm going to press this forward just so that we get a chance to read a poem together. but I'm really enjoying this conversation. So I would love for us to take the next 5 minutes to do a free write, and you can answer all of these questions, any of these questions, just whatever comes to you. Are folks familiar with the concept of reparations? If not, I can give like a brief background. So it's basically this idea, especially for Black and Indigenous people who have been historically exploited and continue to be exploited, for money to be paid back, money that technically is ours because we built things, because we were exploited, for that money to be returned to us. Now, reparations doesn't only have to take the form of money. Some people have proposed land, some people have proposed resources, etc. What would climate reparations look like to you? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? When you think of climate repair, how does inequality factor in? Does it factor in at all? And so we'll take the next 5 minutes to just do some writing to ourselves, and then we'll share out. I see that folks are already starting to put ideas in the chat around climate reparations, thinking about, you know, like how this is a difficult question, you know, thinking about, you know, like lack of choices, but then also like, I see Mary putting in some stuff, invoking some names around like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, giving land. How do we begin to be of service? So I just called out some visions and ideas that I saw in the chat. Would love to open up for a few minutes if anybody has any observations or things that they want to share.
Yes, I've been an environmental activist for, I don't know, 40 years or so. So I just wanted to give this one observation. You go to these protests, originally it was all white, instigated and carried out. Then it changed to the same, but there would be someone, an Indigenous person, giving a prayer at the beginning. Then it changed, well, long and short, eventually now to the point where before the pandemic, the last few protests that I was at were entirely being led and directed by Indigenous people. So in other words, part of the solution to me is giving room for that power shift where the Indigenous people or whoever it is allowed the same equal footing and voice and decision-making capabilities.
Thank you, Rod. I think very much speaking to that last part, decision-making capabilities is so powerful. Nancy.
I was thinking about it in a little different way about reparations to what has been done badly to the climate, like fossil fuel companies being held accountable for the many, many years of basically robbing the earth, and mining companies and the way that trees are cut down. And but also I think these more the companies that have made money off of it, but also things like reflective surfaces on all buildings, dam removal. We have done that in Washington State, rainwater roofs and roof gardens and rainwater collection, and parking lots turned into parks. Basically remove and make surfaces permeable, and reforestation, preserving natural lands and nurturing. So I was thinking of in terms of not so much in terms of the division between people of color and others, but just in general, the kinds of things that we can think about doing beginning to make changes in the whole way we live with the earth.
Yeah. I think that's a wonderful start, Nancy. And I love a lot of the observations about, you know, just like what are like tangible things that we can do. One thing that I would hearken with is that there's always inequality in those decisions about where they go, who's going to receive those resources. So like you said, holding government offices, holding those fossil fuel companies accountable, and really thinking about like who needs to be prioritized in distribution of those resources.
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
see Lori and Mary have hands up.
Okay.
Let's see,
Oh,
Lori.
I was thinking about things like fine arts focused on love of the earth in order to express, if you're going to make changes, you've got to love what it is that you're focused on. Dirt paths, birds everywhere, clean water so you can drink it, running through our cities and towns, earth smells that are relished, appreciated, respect, you know, learning to respect and practicing respect for the earth.
Yes. Thank you, Lori. See Mary and then Jackie and Paul are next.
Okay, like this just gets me super fired up. So I had put a couple of links in the chat. Black Lives Matter has talked about reparations and what that would look like. That's only one point of view, but it's a really good start. To me, it looks also like free college for people, expanding financial aid for people, lowering the limits of, you know, the income requirements so more people can go to college and maintain, you know, a better way of living. And then staying in one's home. You know, it's not just about having a handout or having a government check or something like that, but, you know, actually more structured workshops and things around, you know, how to maintain the taxes or how to, you know, be able to subsidize some of the, you know, smaller repairs and stuff. And the city here is really good about doing some of that stuff, like the program Nancy was talking about with the rain roof collection. The program is called Rainwise, and they will, you know, they will help you sort of assess your property and figure out how you can have, you know, more drought tolerant plants and you know, make your yard or your roof more you know, ecologically sustainable. But, you know, to really begin to take that into many other areas, you know, so that folks can just be able to stay on their property or on their land. And I know the Black farmers, there was a whole thing on 60 Minutes about, there was a big lawsuit because there's only like 2 or 3% of the farmers that are Black farmers anymore that are able to stay on their land. And part of it was because they had, you know, so much difficulty getting loans, and much more difficulty for the small farmer than those big corporations, you know, that are farming hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. So just really focusing in more on individuals and individual stories.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for all of those suggestions, really thinking broadly. I see Jackie and Paul have their hand raised next. I think this is going to be the last person that will share out because we have one more activity before we go to close out.
You know, there's so many systemic structures that are in place to make it harder for people. But just thinking about reparations, two things that popped into my head. The first thing was the money that the countries promised from the cops. I think it's like $100 billion or something, that not a penny's shown up yet. I think the first place is to get that, because there's people that are struggling now or dying now, people that did the least amount of contributing to the climate issue. And the other thing, it seems like we need to maybe analyze true cost. So if it costs 2 cents to make a straw, we should figure out a way that the true, and the cost is passed on because they assume that you're going to throw that on the street, and then the cost goes to someone else. Whereas if the manufacturer has to include the cost of undoing what they've made. So a plastic bag, if it costs a penny to make the plastic bag, but it costs 50 cents to convert that back into something that's non-destructive, well, then it should be the 1 cent plus the 50 cents. And if we start doing that, you kind of get away from that exploitive thing where that we can take whatever we want and what's left over is someone else's problem. No, if you're going to strip mine this place, you've got to put it back the way it should be so it's still useful when you're done. And if you get the true cost, I think that to me seems like reparations.
Absolutely.
You know, you leave no marks. If you're going to dig a hole, you also have to fill it back in when you're done.
Thank you for that observation, Paul. And also, you know, Mary echoed in the chat, first do no harm. I think that that's particularly salient. I don't know if people have seen the reports. It's actually a recycling facility in the Dominican Republic. Had a huge explosion and is leaking sewage into waterways. So immediately we think, okay, recycling plant, good. Things are getting cycled throughout. But even thinking about how sometimes our green approaches are reliant on exploitative measures. So making sure, like what Paul said, recognizing the true cost. Recycling has an environmental impact as well. So making sure that we are recognizing the impact of different facilities and of different products and production mechanisms and factory costs. Thank you, Paul. All right. I am going to skip past this part. This has been like such an awesome, engaging conversation. I've had like this, like more beautiful than I could imagine. So there's a lot of stuff that we won't be able to get to. But what I'm going to do is put a couple of poems in the chat, since you know Valentine's Day is tomorrow, God is love. These are some poems that were inspired by, I don't know if folks are familiar with Pablo Neruda, very famous Chilean poet of the 20th century. And he wrote a lot about love, romantic love, but love of community and love of land. This poet, Craig Santos Perez, took Pablo Neruda's sonnets, and Pablo Neruda's sonnets were just like love sonnets. And Craig Santos Perez wrote them as love poems in the time of climate change. So I'm going to put them in the chat. I will read the first one out loud. Hopefully folks have a chance to look at the next one. And I will also make this presentation available to members if folks want to return to anything. But I guess I'll close out my section with this sonnet. I don't love you as if you were rare earth metals, diamonds, or reserves of crude oil that propagate war. I love you as one loves most vulnerable things, urgently, between the habitat and its loss. I love you as a seed that doesn't sprout but carries the heritage of our roots, secured within a vault. And thanks to your love, the organic taste that ripens from the fruit lives sweetly on my tongue. I love you without knowing how or when the world will end. I love you naturally without pesticides or pills. I love you like this because we won't survive any other way, except in this form in which humans and nature are kin. So close that your emissions of carbon are mine. So close that your sea rises with my heat. Thank you all so much for being such a wonderful and amazing and engaging audience. And let me know how I can support in the future.
Thank you. So I think all of these were questions that at some point in her presentation, Ashia had posed to us. What I would like to propose is that you take a couple of minutes and look over these questions and just pick one, or if you'd like to, that you would like to journal on over the next 2 weeks prior to our conversation webinar on the 27th. You could think about your community and is it homogeneous? Identify 3 communities to which you belong. How often do you interact meaningfully with people of color, with queer people with disabilities, with undocumented citizens? How can you support these communities emotionally, socially, and politically? What would climate reparations look like to you? What does it look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? And when you think of climate repair, how does inequality factor in? Does it factor in at all? Make a note just of that 1 or 2 questions that you'd like to focus on and journal about over the next 2 weeks. And then I also invite you to also research a racial history timeline for your own community and to consider the disparate impacts that the climate crisis is having where you live. So just again to remind you, in 2 weeks, we'll be having a conversation as a follow-on to this session. Would like to welcome all of you back. Hope that you'll have an opportunity to journal as I've just suggested. And then again, to remind you that on the 20th of March, we'll be following up with another session, generally on the theme of eco-racism. We're looking at some different options and speakers that we may be able to engage it with. And so I'd encourage you to come back in 2 weeks. And then just to remind you, from the words of our denominational president, Stephen Veazey, from a sermon that he delivered, I think here in the Greater Pacific Northwest event back in October of 2020. A prophetic people must accurately discern true realities that may not be apparent to others, or realities they may not want to face. And so with that charge to us all, I thank you all for your participation. Hope you're back in 2 weeks, and stay tuned for upcoming events as we provide information about them.